Hello, and welcome to another Roofing Economic Outlook. My name is Heidi Ellsworth, and I'm with Roofers Coffee Shop. And Roofers Coffee Shop is very proud to bring Mischa Fisher, the Chief Economist with Angi, to Roofing Economic Outlook. In fact, the Roofing Economic Outlook is sponsored by Angi because it's that important. For the roofing industry, we need to be on the front lines of what's happening with the economy, where we're going. And so we've brought the premier expert in this field with Mischa. Good morning, Mischa.
Good morning. Great to be with you. It's fun to really record these. And I completely agree. This is very, very important for everybody to understand, to make better decisions for their businesses and their personal lives, and also just know what's going on.
What is going on? What are you seeing this first part of 2022 that's really kind of making for some volatile up and down on the economy?
Sure. So you're right. There's a lot of variability. And I think that this is being noticed by a lot of people in the roofing industry in particular. So what people have been seeing are a couple of different things. First are, if you follow the stock market, there's been a big sell-off among certain types of equity. And so that drops the overall value of the stock indices, especially because a couple of large technology companies, for example, compose a lot of the market. So if they drop, the overall market drops as a whole because there's so much wealth concentrated there. And there's a couple of different things that are going on that are driving this. The biggest thing is that as we come out of the pandemic, a number of things happened over the course of that. The first is that people stopped spending and they started saving. Household savings shot way up. But what this meant was that people were sitting on a lot of cash. And at the same time, the federal government additionally made a lot of stimulus payments and other support payments available to people. The Federal Reserve has been buying trillions of dollars worth of financial assets too, to prop up their value and prevent a crash. And what it does cause is overall saturation of asset markets.
We've been hearing a lot about how there is just a huge increase in the service market also. So is that true?
Partly, yeah, that's definitely true. Partly, the services industry is very, very diverse. And so if we're talking home services has been strong the entire pandemic. There was basically a 1-month recession for home services, and then everything turned back online and people started spending on their homes. And that's still elevated. And, as you and I have talked about before, I think it's going to remain elevated. But the rest of the services industry, let's say leisure and hospitality, what people kind of think about when they mean services, that still has lower employment than before the pandemic because people stopped going to bars and restaurants and vacations at the same rate. Now, the good news is, for our contractor audience, is that the pandemic has been not nearly as disruptive to our industry in a negative way as for other industries. But this overall situation is kind of unique because typically recessions don't hit services as hard as they hit manufacturing. If you think about materials prices, so lumber and sawmills and the plants that turn pulp into various paper and wood products, all those things tend to be very cyclical, as we say, which means that they go up and down pretty dramatically depending on the point of the economic cycle. And typically services, it can have a little up and down, but it's typically much less sensitive to the economic cycle. And so when you have a big recession, typically you don't see leisure and hospitality get hit as hard as manufacturing or construction. But that was not the case. This was a services recession just because it was a recession that came about from an infectious disease. And so overall, it's been a very unique time for all industries, and ours in particular, because the last recession we had hit home services, home construction, home remodeling really, really hard. On the new home construction front, we saw this dramatic multi-point decline in the number of homes being built, and that didn't happen this time around. And the side effect, of course, is that for any roofers that do new construction, obviously that's been ticked up. But then at the same time, if you are doing a lot of remodeling work or replacement work, it means that A, people are doing more of that too, but B, you're also competing for the same materials and labor as everybody else in new construction because we all share the same factories and distribution centers and people to do the installations.
Let's talk a little bit about that inflation factor, because it's all over the news. Mischa, how do you see that affecting the construction, the home improvement, roofing industry?
It's all over the news. It's a big deal. Economists call it the cruelest tax. That's sort of the nickname for inflation, because it lowers your purchasing power in the same way that a tax would, but you don't see it. And it can also be very, very large. You really notice a tax on your income when it goes up, by a percentage point or two. And we saw inflation, just the numbers that came out just this week, showed almost 8% inflation. And so if you have $10,000 in savings, you just took an $800 pay cut in terms of the value of that, a tax that just disappeared and you never saw it. So that's why economists call it the cruelest tax. And it particularly hits people who don't have any assets, because assets can tend to rise. But if all your money is in sort of fixed income or cash, that's where you really, really feel it, versus if you own a used car or house right now, those things are also inflating. So at least your overall worth is going up. So it impacts everybody. Where roofers are going to be seeing it is obviously in both materials and labor, but there's two different stories there. Labor costs are up, and I think any listener knows this if they're trying to recruit people, that they're seeing that the same offers, they've got to raise them an extra $1, $2, or $3 an hour or more. But overall, the average for labor costs in the construction sector is not that high relative to the price of materials. In materials, we're looking at, on average, depends a lot depending on what your mix is, but 35% is a good rule of thumb for people to think about right now for materials. So when you're talking about a material intensive category like roofing, and we've already seen an uptick in the price producers are paying for those materials. And so if you haven't already found yourself paying more for materials, you probably will this year, because producers aren't going to want to just eat that profit loss. They're going to start passing that on to you by raising the prices of what they're selling. And that's for asphalt shingle. If you're looking at things like sheet metal, that's shot way, way up in terms of producer prices. So those are up, about 5 or 10 times more than the increase in asphalt. And pay attention right now. There's a lot going on in the global financial markets and the global commodities markets, and that can really sort of spill back and hit people, say, on the cost of hydrocarbons and whether or not that goes into all the glues and adhesives and petroleum products that are used in the roofing sector. So I think people should really be intentionally paying attention to inflation this year, building it into their pricing, and not focusing on just sort of passively receiving the prices as you incur them running your business. You should be really building a strategy around adapting and managing them, because it is coming.
As contractors, as they're looking at that, we talk a lot about making sure that you have price adjustments in your contracts and that you're able to work through that if there's any changes during a job. Is there any other things that they should kind of be looking at besides beyond contracts around those price increases and inflation?
There is. You're absolutely right. The building the contract piece in there and that flexibility is pretty key, as well as having a strong relationship with your suppliers and distributors as possible, because they're going to be paying attention to what's going on in the buying markets, and they'll give you a good sense of, if you have a strong relationship there, they can be a real source of wisdom. But in terms of other things people should pay attention to, recognize that there's two components to inflation: the materials and the labor costs. But there's also two components to inflation in a different sense, and that is there's what people are incurring in costs, and there's also what they're expecting to incur in costs. And so right now there's this big debate about, will we see an inflation wage spiral? Will we see inflation go up just because people think it's going to go up? Because that's the unique thing about inflation, is that that's how it works. And there's two sides of the debate. One is obviously there's a big, strong awareness of it. People are talking about it, and that's going to make people nervous. And just that cruelty of saying, hey, I got a 2% raise, but my cost went up 8%. That's not, when you cascade that across millions and millions of households, people start getting anxious about it, and they start negotiating harder and looking for more opportunities. But on the other side, we've gotten really used to low inflation over the last 30 years. And if you look at people's future expectations, the Fed just put out a release this week, sort of looking at, are people expecting inflation to come back down? And it does look like people are saying yes. The population thinks it is somewhat transitory. So we'll see if the materials component really is transitory. But in terms of people's expectations, at least right now, there's a reason to be optimistic that it won't necessarily stay at these high elevated areas for a long time. And, if you're thinking about the one silver lining of all this, if you've got a mortgage right now and you're paying 3% of it, an 8% inflation rate isn't bad on for your mortgage, at least, because it means that the total value of your debt obligations are shrinking too. So view that as at least a silver lining if you are a listener with a lot of mortgage or other fixed rate debt, because at least that debt is shrinking at the same rate. There's a growing consensus that we'll probably see 3 or so rate increases this year. Don't hold me to it. If anybody makes a pronouncement with a lot of confidence, be very skeptical. But if people remember, there was a reduction in rates leading up to COVID. And then when COVID came, they all just basically dropped to effectively zero. And so we could see as much as a 50 basis point increase in their rate as soon as March. That's one thing that people are talking about. So we'll see what happens. There's a debate among that circle about whether or not raising interest rates when we have supply constrictions is a good idea. That what we actually have to do is just improve the supply chains, the backlogs at the ports and the manufacturing capacity without hurting the economy's ability to expand. And raising interest rates does that.
Well, it's really interesting what you're saying about growth, business growth, because I've probably talked to 4 to 5 manufacturers within the last couple weeks who are all having new plants coming on, new production. They are working at growing and to meet the demand of the materials out there. So there's a lot of people who are taking advantage of those low rates right now, or have been in the last year, and we're going to start seeing some of the benefits of that coming soon.
Yeah, absolutely. There should be hopefully more of that. And then also more, I think this has made a lot of people wake up and say, hey, maybe I need to make my materials a little bit closer to where they're being used, because you're already facing potential plant shutdowns and the shutdowns of your raw inputs. But when you add that additional complexity of having to get it to market when it's a long ways away, that's just another layer of things to go wrong. It's really remarkable our supply chains work given how complicated they are. And so it's not, I think, particularly surprising that we've had all these hurdles, but I think it certainly is letting a lot of people who make and sell products right now realize that there is potentially a strong benefit to being able to get your products to market if your competitors or if their materials are stuck on a container ship in the middle of the ocean.
When you have all these new plants, you have all this increased business, the unemployment rates improved in the recent jobs report, but we're still seeing a huge labor shortage within roofing. What are you seeing in the labor market?
There's the construction labor market, and then there's everything else. I mean, everything is tight right now, but the construction labor market, residential construction, we're already a percentage or point or two higher in terms of total employment than we were before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, we already had a really, really tight labor market.
Yeah.
I was going around to conferences talking to people about the trades labor shortage before COVID, and those had big audiences and a lot of engagement because people were already suffering from it. And then after that, we saw demand spike by, another big percent, 20, 30%, and people drop out of the labor force and wages go up for those who were in the labor force. So we took an existing pretty intense problem and just made it even more intense. And I think that there's some things we really need to think about in terms of the construction trades. We've really relied on this very informal relationship between training and employer and contractor and sub and temporary work. And it's not clear, in my opinion, that we can make that last forever. I think that there's a certain amount of shepherding that has to go on to get people into the trades and to stay in the trades, even though we've got very high job satisfaction. And we do pay a very nice premium over other sectors of the economy. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going far enough to really keep people in the trades. And that's where there's so much room to go in terms of pipelines and different recruitment channels and other forms of sort of profit sharing or other incentives to get people to come and stay in the trades. And, roofing's a tricky one because it's so labor intensive.
Right.
I think that that's where we'll see more manufacturers get smarter about making products that are also labor saving too. That's going to be a really big one, because that's an additional competitive advantage that a manufacturer can give to contractors in the field, is in addition to getting a good product and you'll save callbacks and it'll work, I can also save you that install time because I know you don't have the labor to install it. So I think it's a very interesting and dynamic time in the trades, but we've definitely got to do more in terms of mirroring some of the successful things we've seen in other sectors of the economy around recruitment and retention, because we offer the job satisfaction and we offer the wages, but we're missing the boat on some of these other items.
So we started out talking about the variables of the market. Are there any, from what we're talking about, are there any that are influencing the economy that are not getting a lot of attention, that maybe you can talk to us about, that maybe we're not aware of or not hearing on the news every day?
It would be nice if there was some secret indicator that was out there that I could point everybody to, but I think we do a pretty good job of talking about a lot of the things that matter. And the more niche ones that we haven't been talking about as much are going to, because we've been talking about unemployment rates and we've been talking about the Fed's top line rate, but we haven't necessarily talked about mortgage rates too, to some degree, but we haven't necessarily talked about a couple of other things. One is the price of fuel. So people have been talking a lot about the price of fuel going up, but we're not really thinking about what that top line could go to. And if we do see something happen in Eastern Europe right now with the Russians and Ukraine, that could really hit prices further, because there's a lot of oil and gas that comes out of there, and this is a globally traded market. So if you reduce the supply at any point, you could really see prices go up. So that's going to hit you in terms of driving around, but also, with roofing, where we use a lot of hydrocarbon intense products, that could potentially spill over into even higher materials prices than they were already going to be. Another thing to think about is shipping rates. What's the price that people are paying for trucking and for containers? We already sort of alluded to it. A lot of stuff is made here domestically in the US because it's very heavy. And that's sort of a good rule of thumb when you're trying to think about how close is something made relative to where it's used. The biggest predictor is going to be, well, how heavy is it and what is the price per material? And I think those are sort of the big ones. And then the final thing is, do really pay attention to this inflation number. I don't think people are wrong to focus on it. It can have a really big impact on your business. It's the potential difference between a profit and a loss, which is really, really the main thing that everybody has to care about. So that's where one should really be cognizant of paying attention to those inflation numbers, adapting your business to it, trying to see it coming and get in front of it so that you're never stuck, holding the bag for a price you quoted at 3 or 4 months ago, and then inflation went up and it ate into your profit.
Great points, great takeaways for everyone out there. This is why we're doing this. It's just exactly, thank you, Mischa, to really get this information out, to get everyone thinking about your contracts, thinking about your business, watching those numbers. And we will be doing this like every 6 weeks. So please join us regularly to hear these economic outlooks. You can find it on the homepage of Rufus Coffee Shop. You can find it on the directory for Angi, which is on Rufus Coffee Shop. And of course, you can find it on your favorite podcast channel and YouTube. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mischa, and everyone. Have a great day.